Tuesday, February 10th, 1981 should have been a regular day for the students at Cedar Edge High in Colorado. And it was for almost all of them. 17-year-old Roger woke up early and did his morning routine. He showered, ate breakfast, took the bus to school. He even made it to put his books in his locker. But Roger would never report to class, and nobody would see so much as a glimpse of Roger at school after that, or ever again. Those close to Roger said he had so many things going for him, but that in recent days he seemed bothered by something. Could whatever was weighing heavily on Roger be the key to his disappearance? This is A Simpler Time, True Crime, The Disappearance of Roger Ellison. Before I get into this case, I want to first acknowledge the original reporting that I'm going to rely heavily on for the case. As a reminder, all source material is listed in the show notes, but this particular person I want to highlight is a journalist named Lori Compson Harrison, and she was a Colorado journalist dedicated to finding answers in Roger's case. She even created a WordPress site where she compiled articles, timelines, and her own notes. I've linked that. She was even still posting about the case in the spring of 2011, when she was in the final months of fighting terminal melanoma. She died in September of that year after a 7-year battle at age 48. And she wasn't just any reporter. She was a classmate of Roger's, which is why she was so determined to use her investigative journalism skills to help his family find answers. I was inspired by all the work she did on this case, and I hope that sharing Roger's case will complement the work she put into keeping it going, and that I can help keep her legacy going. Not only that, as you'll hear when I get into the case, the profound impact his disappearance had on his family broke my heart. And if any attention to his case gets people to keep talking about it and move towards answers, that's my goal. So, let's get into it. Roger Ellison was born March 11th, 1963. He was the fifth and youngest child of his parents, Ernest and Evelyn. Roger's siblings were 3 brothers, Bill, Bob, and Roy, and a sister, Becky. Roger was an incredible skier. He was even working to qualify for the U.S. Olympics team, and he was really close to that goal. There's no better place for an avid skier to live than Colorado. Roger and his family lived in Eckerd, Colorado, and Roger attended Cedar Edge High School in neighboring Cedar Edge. Eckerd is a formerly unincorporated community that is now part of the town of Orchard City in Delta County, Colorado. It's about 50 miles southeast of Grand Junction. But don't let the name Orchard City deceive you. The population is not like that of a city and is only around 3,500 people. The community of Cedar Edge, where the high school was located in, is at the base of the Grand Mesa National Forest in western Colorado along Highway 65. Roger liked to keep to himself. He wasn't really known for connecting much with people his age. He was really close with his family and very focused on skiing. People in school described him as more of a loner. His mother looked at it a little differently. He was just set on his interests, and she described him as friendly when he got comfortable, but bashful and shy. Very mild-mannered. I have some photos of Roger on my Instagram, at SimplerTimeCrimePod, and even before I started reading about his case, that was the first impression I got just from his picture. He has a very mild-mannered presence about him. Roger loved to wear colorful ski sweaters and white turtlenecks, and that was kind of his signature look. He was very close with his father. His dad had been forced to retire early due to a stroke and open heart surgery, and Roger spent a lot of time with him, both in a caretaker role, but also just bonding. They were just very, very close-knit. The weekend before Roger disappeared, he attended a ski competition in Telluride, Colorado, where he was hoping to place for the United States Ski B team, but he didn't quite make it. He was disappointed, but his mother said not unusually so, and he was very forward-thinking. They talked about it, and he even had a good outlook for what was to come. He had another competition that following weekend. In fact, on that fateful morning of Tuesday, February 10th, he had looked out the window before heading off to school. He told his mother that it looked like it was about to snow that afternoon, and that fresh snow was a good omen for his upcoming ski competition that weekend. So his mom pretty much thought he must have moved on from the previous loss that weekend. She said he was upbeat. At 8 a.m., he boarded the bus to go a few miles up the road to school. He shared locker number 191 with a classmate named Mitch in the school's basement. Just a side note here, what the heck, Cedar Edge High School? I do not like that. Why do we need basement lockers? Like, that's out of a horror movie. 0 stars, not here for it, creepy. Okay, I'm going to force myself to move past that. His locker mate, as well as a few classmates, saw him dropping off his books into his locker. Mitch remembered this because Roger had actually yelled for him to hold the door open as he was about to close it because he needed to drop some books off before he went to his first period class. Mitch did so, and they said hello, and Roger told Mitch he'd catch up with him later. And then, just like that, he vanished. He never reported to homeroom or any of his classes. Roger's school bus came to the school drop-off that afternoon near his neighborhood, but he did not get off. This concerned his parents because he had no other way of getting home, and he hadn't communicated to them any change in plans. They called the school to see if he was still there, and they were surprised to learn that Roger hadn't attended any classes that day. Roger had perfect attendance at Cedar Edge High School, so this was not like him. Nowadays, there are communication requirements to parents and guardians when students don't show up to school, without a phone call excusing them otherwise. But at this time, parents only found out because they were calling to see themselves. And I'm going to kind of give the school some grief for this because even if this wasn't the standard back then, if the perfect attendance kid no-shows to school with no phone call, it just seems like that would warrant concern. And how come none of his classmates who saw him that morning inquired as to why he wasn't in any of his classes after that? I know kids don't pay attention as much, it just seemed a little bit odd to me. Ernest and Evelyn called around to his friends from skiing and school to see if he was staying with any of them or if anybody had seen him, but as you guessed it, they hadn't. That evening, the couple paced back and forth, waiting for him to come home, and they figured they would give him till at least morning, so they spent a sleepless night waiting up for him, with each passing moment leaving concern bubbling up more and more. By morning, they felt like they couldn't wait any longer, and they contacted police. But you guessed it, police said they couldn't take a report. And not just the 24 hours that we're used to hearing about, they actually told the family they couldn't take one for 48. Listen, I'm trying not to hate on cops right now, but this is a very small town in Colorado. What resources are you even wasting just trying to locate him? What else are you doing? Writing parking tickets? This isn't high call volume area, so just take down the information and go looking for this kid. I never understand when people get police officers and police departments digging their heels on these timelines. Just go try to find this kid. Roger's parents felt they couldn't wait, so they drove around looking for him themselves, even with his father in poor health. His mother described it as her worst nightmare coming true. When it did come time for police to initiate a search, police considered that he had just been a runaway. Maybe he was more depressed than his parents realized with not making the U.S. ski team, or perhaps he was dealing with some mental health concerns or having a bit of a crisis of what to do next with his life with high school about to end. But this didn't make sense to them. He had never been depressed before, any more than any other typical kid, and he had a ski competition the very next weekend just a few days away. He left all his ski equipment behind along with his car and his motorcycle. He didn't touch his bank account, which had $1,000 in it. He had put a deposit down at Western State University in Gunnison, Colorado, where he planned to attend school. He was a straight-A student, and all he left with that day were the clothes on his back and $3 cash. Detective Keith Wabel, who was assigned to the case, said that despite everything Evelyn and Ernest said to him he still felt Roger was just a runaway. He was quoted as saying, quote, "I think he's out of state. I think he just got fed up and left. I can't find any indication of foul play," end quote. Roger's mother, Evelyn, said, quote, "He was such a good boy. He wasn't a runaway. But how do you convince people?" It sounds cliche, but Roger really did vanish into thin air. His parents struggled immensely with the pain of not knowing where he was or what happened to him. Alongside law enforcement, they distributed missing persons posters all over the country, hoping that somebody would recognize him somewhere. May of 1981 came, and the night of what would have been Roger's graduation showed up. The school offered for Evelyn and Ernest to accept the diploma on his behalf, but they were too devastated to do so. Instead, a classmate of Roger's, a friend named Shauna Peterson Axtell, accepted the diploma for him. Roger's parents were there, sitting in their car overlooking the football field and sobbing. By July, they were desperate and put up an $8,000 reward to anyone who might have information on what happened to their son. Roger's father, Ernest, said, quote, "It's awful not knowing. We've had deaths in the family. My wife and I both lost our parents. This is worse than that. We've spent a lot of money and heartbreak trying to locate our son. We have to keep going, but it doesn't look very good." End quote. The school bus driver who drove Roger said that every day after his disappearance, his dad would be at the bus stop in the afternoon, and he would scan the students with his eyes wide open as they were getting off the bus, and he would just look for his son. And each day, he would hang his head after all the students got off and cry that his son wasn't amongst them. Sadly, just weeks later, in August of 1981, Ernest would suffer another stroke, and on August 21st, he would die from complications of that at the young age of 58. Ernest would be put to rest, and Roger did not show up to the funeral. His family did not need convincing that foul play was involved in his disappearance as it stood. They felt that way from the beginning. But this was a turning point where police began to look more into this case as foul play. No matter the circumstance, if Roger had run away on his own free will, he would have come back for his beloved father's funeral services. The local police tried to get the FBI involved at this point because of their limited experience with missing persons cases. But the FBI would not take the case because there was no clear sign of foul play, and there was no indication that there was a crossing of state lines. Those were a couple of their requirements. In interviewing Roger's family, they each shared some unique details with law enforcement, and here's a couple of them. His oldest brother Roy indicated that Roger just seemed off to him the last time he saw him. When he was later interviewed in 1998 by the Daily Sentinel, he shared that when he was alone with Roger that last time he saw him, he tried to talk to him, but Roger just sort of hung his head. He described him as looking like, quote, he had 15,000 things on his mind. Roy was joining the Navy when Roger was still a baby, so there was quite the sibling age gap, and he was almost like an additional parent figure to Roger, but he wouldn't open up even to his big brother about whatever was troubling him that day. Early in the investigation, Evelyn shared suspicions about someone who just gave her a bad vibe. And that was a teacher of Roger's. His name is publicly out there in all sorts of source material, but he's never been charged or named as an official suspect in this crime, so I'm going to refer to him as Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith was a teacher and a wrestling coach at Cedar Edge High School in 1981. He taught history and psychology. Evelyn basically said he just gave her bad vibes. Mr. Smith's home was right next door to the school, and some sources say that Mr. Smith used to have students drop homework assignments off at his house. Obviously, I'd be remiss in not pointing out that as we talk about things being a more simpler time back then, this would absolutely not fly today, and with good reason. That's just weird and inappropriate. Roger was said to be one of the students who did drop homework off at his house. And it wasn't just that. Evelyn stated that Mr. Smith visited her after his disappearance and told Evelyn that he did some informal counseling and mentoring of Roger at his house and that Roger was depressed. He told Roger's parents that he was suicidal and likely killed himself. Evelyn was suspicious of all of this and told police that Roger always said he didn't really care for Mr. Smith, so she had a hard time believing that Roger would go over for any sort of counseling or social emotional help. Evelyn told several friends of hers that she had a funny feeling about Mr. Smith and felt he was somehow involved in her son's disappearance. She also felt that her son's classmates knew more than they were letting on. Mr. Smith would resign from his position at Cedar Edge High School and move to California, where he still resides today. Evelyn Ellison would die at the age of 70 on February 9th, 1992, just one day shy of the 11-year anniversary of Roger's disappearance. After Evelyn's death, police began to re-interview witnesses, and that's when they got a tip from a classmate of Roger's that they should dig up the property beneath a local mortuary. And what is the significance of this local mortuary, you ask? Back in 1981, it was a privately owned home, the home of none other than Mr. Smith. This eyewitness student said they observed Mr. Smith digging up his property shortly after Roger's disappearance. With nothing else to go on, police decided to pursue this lead in hopes that it would lead to Roger's remains. According to an article in the Daily Sentinel, they were acting on a tip from a former classmate and that the Delta County Sheriff's Department investigators, along with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and a statewide grave investigation team called NecroSearch, dug up a section of the yard of the Taylor mortuary 20 feet by 12 feet by 2.5 feet. This did not produce anything, and that was in March of 1994, but they decided to try again in April. According to another Sentinel article, when they dug again, they did find a handful of possible spots in the ground that they planned to study further. The spots were probed via ground-penetrating radar from that same NecroSearch International team, and the radar found 6 spots where land below the surface had been disturbed. So then they decided to concentrate on those spots and exhume those 6 areas in the next couple weeks after that and see what they found. They were able to find some bones in this search, but they were determined to be animal bones. And Roger's remains were not discovered anywhere on the property, and there was nothing that connected Roger to anything in their search below the ground. Also in April of 1994, Roger's case would be featured on the Sally Jesse Raphael talk show, which produced a couple sightings that were reported to police, but none of those panned out. The next month, in May of 1994, a property owner several blocks away from the mortuary drew attention of authorities when the property owner called to say that they found a marked grave on their property. It was described as outlined in stones and marked by a headstone, and it was several hundred feet back on their property, and they just happened to stumble upon it. Sheriff Bill Blair was skeptical. He said, quote, "It's pretty obvious it's an old grave. I don't think a killer would kill somebody and then mark where they buried the person." And like Blair suspected, this was a dead end. After none of their digs produced any leads, they felt stuck. Blair said, quote, "We need to do more interviewing and go a different direction before we dig up the whole countryside," end quote. His tone was understandably frustrated and defeated, and the next lead wouldn't come again until June of 1998. In June of 1998, a dying man contacted authorities in Delta County and said he had to get something off his chest before he died. He said he knew what happened to Roger Ellison. According to the dying man's account, he and a friend were poaching deer in a wooded area northwest of Cedar Edge in early spring of 1981 when they came upon a young man whose hands were bound by white cord being held at gunpoint by another man. One of the eyewitnesses who picked Ellison out of a photo lineup reported hearing 2 gunshots several minutes after the pair left the area. The 2 men had decided then and there that they would never talk about it, and they promised each other that they would erase it from their memories and never bring it up again. Police administered a polygraph test to this dying man, and he passed. They also administered one to the friend who was with him, and he passed his polygraph, and he also corroborated the story. This is considered to be credible and now kind of the leading theory about what happened to Roger, but I have so many questions. How did this gunman just let 2 men get away? Were they not afraid of being identified? Did this gunman threaten the witnesses, or did the gunman just never see these men and they were able to sneak away? To me, if this were the case, I do think these men saw more than what they're letting on. But what did that dying man have to lose if that was the case? Why not just fully come clean right then and share what you know, because you're going to die anyways? Tabling some of that line of questioning for the moment, let's suppose this is Roger. How did he get from Cedar Edge High School to these woods? Was he abducted at gunpoint from the school basement? Was he lured outside and then abducted? And for what purpose? Roger was known as being straight-laced, though it was suspected that he did partake in some marijuana use, which is, not uncommon for high schoolers to do. People wondered if maybe he had begun getting involved with selling marijuana and had gotten into a bad situation with that. Maybe this was what was on his mind in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. His mother also always believed it was possible he saw something he shouldn't have while he was competing the weekend prior in Telluride. If that was the case and that was related to his death, it would mean 2 things. 1, his mood when visiting his brother was unrelated to his death because that was before this ski trip. And 2, this implicates members of his ski team or people he associated with through skiing in whatever happened to him. In September of 1998, just a few months later, searchers along with anthropologists from Western State University, where Roger was supposed to go to school, conducted a search for bones and evidence in the area where this confrontation with the gunman supposedly happened, but nothing was found. Not bones, not clothing, not shell casings, nothing. Absolutely 0 clues despite a huge turnout and effort. And that was the last update in the case for a decade. In 2008, the web sleuths community generated a new lead. If you're a fan of this podcast, you've heard me talk about web sleuths in a couple of episodes now, namely the Tammy Jo Alexander episode and Gail Joyner. Web sleuths is an online community of armchair detectives, but they really pull together a ton of resources to compare theories, and particularly things like unidentified John and Jane Does, and they cross-reference them to missing persons cases. They've helped to identify quite a few people over the years. In 2008, a Web Sleuths forum user recognized that Roger Ellison had a lot of distinct similarities to an unidentified John Doe from case file 1107-UMCO. This is an unidentified white male whose skeletal remains were found in September of 1981 in Chaffee County, Colorado. The John Doe is estimated to be about 15 to 19 years old, approximately 5 foot 6 inches tall, and weighing 136 pounds. According to the case history, the victim was located on September 10, 1981, in a wooded area near Clear Creek in northern Chaffee County. More bones were found in 1986 that a pathologist indicated were probably from the same person. There were also 3 cartridge shell casings found near the second set of bones. Found with the body, the clothing was blue jeans, which were a 33 waist and a 31 inseam, green and brown corduroy jacket, this was found near the body, and then also near the body there were several books of matches, one from Plaza Bowling in Illinois, and one from Eugene Hoster Insurance Company in Pennsylvania. I'll share the photo on the Instagram of the reconstruction of this John Doe, and I will provide a link to it. I do know this poster contacted authorities with this lead to say, hey, I think you should compare this to Roger. And I can't find anything specifically from law enforcement that definitively says Roger was ruled out against this John Doe. But before she died, Lori Compson Harrison posted on the WordPress site that preliminary dental records were not a match. This John Doe is still listed as unidentified, and you can find this John Doe on the NamUs website. I will link it. This is the last of what we know in terms of updates to Roger's case. Normally, I am super cautious to share anything on here that is very speculative in nature, particularly the on and off chatter through web sleuths and through Reddit threads, but Roger's case took a unique turn in the web sleuths and armchair detective portion of the internet, and I just want to speak to some of what was discussed, so long as you as the listener are aware that this is internet speculation and you should take that for what it is. But the why behind sharing it is that the teacher, Mr. Smith, allegedly shows up to comment on Roger's case in a lot of these forums. Now, anybody can create a username, so there's no proving that this is Mr. Smith and not some other person on the internet, but Lori Compson Harrison tended to think that it was him, and it's of my opinion that it is too, just based on some of the information he knows. He is so specific in his responses, and there's a lot of things that I think would be hard to fake. But just, there's no way I can possibly cover it all. But if you deep dive into this case after my episode, which I encourage you to do so, go for it. It's quite a rabbit hole. You'll be able to find it. And I just want to cover some of the discussions. A lot of the discussion happened around these quote-unquote counseling sessions and what students experienced with Mr. Smith. In summary, it seems like his house became a hangout spot for certain students and that there was drug use and sex, etc. Here are two comments that users on the forum who apparently attended Cedar Edge High School had. The first comment reads as follows, quote, "I don't know if you were responsible for Roger Ellison's disappearance, but I do know that you used your position of trust and psychology to manipulate certain students, even if they were wanting to be a part of your life. They trusted you, and they trusted that you had their best interest in your thoughts and that they were special. Isn't that what you wanted? You took no heed that your actions might have side effects. People can use their knowledge for or against or for their own personal wants. We all have things we need to ask forgiveness for, and I do believe you have a consequence now or later." End quote. The second commenter goes into even more detail. They say, quote, "I was in 7th grade at the time Roger disappeared. It impacted my older sibling, who was one of those teenagers meeting in Mr. Smith's house. Who knew that 3.5 years later, I would be a victim of his so-called counseling? Yes, there was definitely drug use, drinking, and underage sex going on. I know because I was there. He cannot deny it. It took me a few years after it happened to realize what happened and that it wasn't my doing. I was just a kid with low self-esteem, and that's exactly the kind of kids he preyed upon. Unfortunately, high schools are filled with them, a great hunting ground for someone like Mr. Smith. I'm doing great now. I have a lot of confidence and hardly give a thought to this predator anymore. A friend of mine told me about this website, so I had to take a look. It does trouble me, and always has, that this predator still teaches and is probably still abusing his power. I did talk to investigators years ago, but unfortunately it was too late to prosecute for what was done to me. I'm always hoping someone whom it is currently happening to will have the courage to talk." End quote. So those were two commenters who were following all the web sleuths chatter, and they had contacted the journalist who ran the web sleuth site directly themselves, Lori, and shared these specific comments with her, and she posted them to her website. I am always of the believe survivors camp, so that is what I am leaning into. Just for the sake of this podcast, though, like I said, there's no way that I can verify who's behind these, and I'm cautious to share internet chatter, but the reason why I did these is just because this could very much have significant impact on what happened to Roger. So there's way more where all of that came from and a lot of accusations thrown around. And then all of a sudden, this account claiming to be Mr. Smith showed up on WebSleuth and commented very antagonistically on Roger's case. And I'm going to share some of what is said when it's actually relative to Roger's case. And I want you to know I'm not cherry picking what information I share. It's just that he really goes off on a tangent and it's kind of self-indulgent and just unrelated in parts. So I don't want to share all of that for the sake of your time and to keep it relevant to Roger's actual case. So when Mr. Smith allegedly shows up on WebSleuth, he says, quote, "Hi, sleuthies. I use this term because it is obvious that you all lack the skill necessary to be a true sleuth. And what is that needed skill? The ability to reason, both deductively or inductively. What you all do is take a questionable rumor, factualize it so you can make it fit your needs, and then pat yourselves on the back thinking you have made a substantial advance in criminal investigations. It's rather obvious that you're a group of wannabes, so get out your yellow legal pad and pencil so we can begin the process." End quote. Again, I'm not going to go through everything he says, but I'm just going to go through a few of the topics. When it comes to addressing the counseling sessions that occurred at his house, he says, quote, "As to whether or not I had counseled other pretty young boys, the gay thing, this question was reiterated by different user account. This is nothing more than being rude at the least and vicious in its manner. I'm sure that if the two of you were sitting next to each other, the high fives and giggling would be endless. So these detective skills you're so proud of, did you learn them in junior high school because you were acting like some adolescent twits?" End quote. I do find it interesting that he refers to it over and over throughout this, not just this quote, but when I'm reading the other ones he said, he just keeps calling it as gay behavior instead of what it really is, which is predatory sexual behavior towards minors. And he doesn't really deny it in that. He does go on to deny it later, but in those instances, he doesn't. He then went on to mock the community for the John Doe comparison because of the height difference. The Colorado John Doe was thought to be around 5'6", and Roger was closer to 6 feet tall. So he mocks the community's attention to detail and said he didn't think people shrunk half a foot when they died. He then comments on the poacher theory and says, "The poacher story, this one is very odd. There are supposedly two men carrying high-powered rifles who come upon a man with a shotgun and another person who is bound, and yet they don't do anything about it. Why? Because they are worried they will be charged with poaching? Give me a break. And one passes a lie detector test on his deathbed, so melodramatic. And of course, we all know that lie detector tests are infallible. It should be very easy to get the names of men involved if this is a true story." Now, I don't want to agree with Mr. Smith here because based on everything I've read on the internet, I'm not the biggest fan of him. But I do agree with him here. This is a lot of the issues I took with that theory, but it does seem to be the theory that police tend to go with. As far as commenting on the digging up of the yard of his former property, he says, quote, "Digging up the yard, talk about a waste of time and money. The only time I ever did any digging was to replace or add rose bushes and to create foundation holes for my children's swing set in the backyard, which remained when we left. By the way, Cedar Edge is roughly 6,000 feet or so, and we had snow on the ground well into April, so the ground is not easily dug up. It can be done, but would take an extended amount of time unless one used machinery. As for anomalies under the concrete floor of the garage, I'm not even sure where that is since we did not have a garage. We had to park our car on the street in front of our house." End quote. So me personally, I did find that interesting, his commentary, and I'll be interested to hear what you guys think as well. Please comment on the Instagram post what your thoughts are or on the episode wherever you listen to podcasts. In regards to the parties at his house and the drug use and the sex and all of that, he said, quote, "The only way I can describe this one is my having encounter groups in my home. That's a total fabrication. If I did permit such a thing, I would like to think I would have added some type of historical theme to it, such as requiring dress up in Roman-style togas and speaking in pig Latin. That I was the go-to guy for marijuana, again, another story which is totally fabricated. And then to imply that the police covered it up because they benefited somehow. Do you really want to go there? I guess you do. Please realize that freedom of speech or clever disclaimers at the bottom of one's post do not protect one from all liability." End quote. Instead, Mr. Smith shared what he thought the police should be looking into, and this is just a few of his bullet points. He thought that it should be looked into that there were sightings of Roger hitchhiking out of town that morning. He thought it should be looked into that there were rumors that Roger was seen talking to two people that morning, and he was saying kind of like, well, where was this? Who were these people? Was it in the school, outside of the school? More should be looked into with that. And he also said it was odd that Roger brought a ton of books back with him that morning, and he actually went into a little bit of the details about textbook use in his class and how often, and he said it was weird that Roger would need all his books that morning and that it was a sign that Roger knew he wasn't going to need them anymore and was returning them. That is very much a stretch to me. If I'm thinking of starting a life over somewhere, I'm not worried about returning school books. And if I'm suicidal, I'm not worried about returning school books. I'm pretty sure I still have an old high school science textbook somewhere that I never returned. I don't think that's a kid's top priority. The final point I'll address is what Mr. Smith allegedly says, if this is him on this online profile, about his personal relationship with Roger. And I apologize, it's a little long, and I'm not the hugest fan of people reading things verbatim to me, but I hope you guys can bear with me because I do think it's important information. He says, "The next part deals with my relationship with Roger. Simply put, there was no relationship other than the fact that he was in my class. I recall that he sat in the back of class and he never really participated in the class discussions. But on to the accusations. He brought homework to my house so he could go skiing on the weekends. I cannot say he never did this. It may have occurred once, at the most twice, but not more than that. Depending on when this supposedly happened would also be an important factor in my not remembering it. Since it was supposedly done by Roger so he could go skiing, that would have occurred in the winter. Although November is possible as the month, it would depend on the amount of snowfall for that year. Chances are it was December or January, and the wrestling season had begun. December is taken up with tournaments every single weekend, so I wouldn't have been home. Had he showed up, my wife would have been the person he gave his homework to. That is why I can't say he never did it, but I would not have allowed it to continue more than twice. I have always had a strict homework policy. I do not accept late work, so I can see his concern that it be turned in on time, early if necessary. However, I also believe that all students must have the same opportunities. To do otherwise is to discriminate for the benefit of some and the loss for others. So if I allowed him to do it, I would also have allowed all my students the right to do it. That is why I would not have permitted or not have allowed him to turn it in at my home. It would be too easy for some students to say that they had dropped it off at my house and that I had lost it, when the fact would be more likely that they just hadn't done it. In regards to January, that was the beginning of the new semester, if I recall correctly. There would have been one study sheet, possibly two, assigned for the new semester that month, and that would have been the only homework, since my classes are lecture-based. And this idea that Mr. Ellison allegedly confronted me about the homework issue never happened. This is pure fabrication created to support this concern about Roger showing up to turn in homework. That I, quote, counseled Roger over and over issues that he had, again, pure fabrication. As you have noted, I majored in history in college, not psychology. I only had 2 lower division college courses in psychology at that time, so I knew that my knowledge was very limited. I had never taught psychology before moving to Cedar Edge, and it was only my second year at this time. It was one of these situations for a teacher where they say, quote, stay one chapter ahead of the students, end quote. So why was I teaching psychology at all? It's what was needed, along with history classes and wrestling coach. And for many schools, the need for a coach outweighs the academic training of the teacher. If the teacher is credentialed in the subject area, then they are allowed to teach any of the courses offered in that subject area. The reality is, I taught mostly history courses. There is one interesting fact that I have learned. Upper-level math and science teachers are not usually considered rocket scientists. English teachers are not viewed as poets and authors. Even history or government teachers are not seen as historians or lawyers. But if you tell someone you teach psychology, for whatever reason, people think that you are a psychologist and therefore a therapist. I don't have the coursework training nor the license to do so. This also brings into dispute my, quote, alleged diagnosis of Roger as being suicidal, end quote. For me to do that would be ludicrous, not to mention illegal. As I stated, he sat in the back of the class and rarely participated. I really don't know anything about him, but this fabricated story helps the contention that I either had something to do with his disappearance or possibly knew about it. There is another possibility that hasn't been considered. Is it possible that Roger told his parents he was going to my house to talk to me and went somewhere else instead? Golly, the idea of a teenager misleading his or her parents, isn't that a shocker? End quote. Roger has not been seen by anyone since 1981. If he were still alive today, he would be 61 years old. At the time of his disappearance, he was 5'11" to 6 feet tall, 145 pounds. He was white with blonde hair and blue eyes. He wore a size 12 or 13 shoe. He has a double crown birthmark and he may have a cleft chin. He was last seen wearing a blue t-shirt, jeans or brown pants, a light blue nylon parka, white socks, and sneakers. If you have any information on the disappearance of Roger Ellison, please contact the Delta County Sheriff's Office at 970-874-9734. This has been A Simpler Time True Crime, a weekly true crime podcast that challenges the notion that everything was safer way back when. If you like this podcast and appreciate the work I'm doing to bring attention to these cold cases, please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts and tell a friend. You can follow our community on Facebook at A Simpler Time True Crime Podcast page, or you can follow us on Instagram at Simpler Time Crime Pod. If you have case suggestions, please visit the Buzzsprout webpage and click on Fan Mail. You can also email me at simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening.